Well, hello, everybody. Wasa Iati, how are you doing? I'm really delighted to be hosting Dr. Jessica Bissett Parea for the Alaska Book Week. This is a celebration of Indigenous writing and, of course, featuring Alaska Native writers. And we're going to be discussing Dr. Jessica's major tome, by the way, which is got a beautiful cover. And I very much have enjoyed reading it, so I can't wait to talk with you about it. But I want to just do a quick introductions. I'm Maria Williams. Maria Shanfla Williams, Yuhat Duisak, Yel na Katsiti, Deshita na Katsiti, Dekalawidi Yeti Ayahat, Atlain Kwanka, Carcross Tagish First Nations Ayahat, Anchich Hachati. My name is Maria Williams. My Tlingit name is Shanfla. I'm of the Raven Moiety and a child of the killer whale and of the Deshitan clan. My ancestral villages are Atlin, which is in northern British Columbia, and Carcross Tagish First Nations, which are the two of the three inland Tlingit villages. But I was born and raised here in Anchorage. Tikatnu is one of the Dena'ina place names. So I always love to give a wonderful shout out. And of course, I'm in Dr. Jessica's homeland. Grew up here, so I'm very privileged for that. So I will let Dr. Jessica now introduce herself, our esteemed author.
And Dr. Maria had asked if I would do the slideshow version of my introduction that I've been doing, which is complete credit to Sandra Shaganoff-Stewart, who I have learned from afar through all of her YouTube videos and Dena'ina language materials. So let me pull that up. And we'll start, and you'll see that I divided into three sections, which I have a much longer explanation that can be for another time of why I do it. But usually when we share, as Dr. Maria just did, our introductions, right, we say who our peoples are, oftentimes our places, and to that I add at the end projects. And so you'll hear me talk today quite a bit about this kind of tripartite peoples, places, projects, but this is my introduction. So Yaledu, Jessica Bissett Parea Shi'i Kilan. Dena'ina Dekishna Shlanshida. Kanakaatna Ishlanshida. Kanakatnu Shugu Shagaya Kilanda. Sheldina Drele Te'ana Ishlanshida. Unkoika Shata Anik Nikola Shugu Relatin. Shita Virginian color, Shagure Latin. Philistau Shita John Platt Shata Ki Rilana. Shunkta Debra Platt in Lanink Uri. Shadeshna Ketsi Dinea Shlanshida. Mary Burkhodel Shita Kenneth Bissett Shata Rilana. Stukta Ronald Bissett in Lanink Uri. Skizlan de Reyatnu. Shukta Lanite Shugu Kotan Ratna Reluda. Hallie Staja, Rachel Staja. John Carlos Presh Ken. Josephine Sta'a, Jacob Shea. Ramaya Tusholoni Itlena Yalamu Shaguya Studa. Patwan Ithlena Putatoi Ka'a Shaguya Studa. Chananhesh Kashashnu. Dena'ina Dudeli Sheep. And as Sandra and others will tell you, there are only a handful of Dena'ina speakers left. And so one of my pandemic projects, in addition to finishing the book, was to work on introducing myself and starting to learn the language, because that's an important part of sounding who we are. And so that's kind of my new 40s decade project. But in terms of places and spaces that have shaped my ways of knowing, my academic pursuits led me from Dena'ina Thlena, my ancestral homelands, to Coast Salish lands named Stubos, currently occupied by Edmonds Community College, where I earned a general transfer degree and performed with a semi-professional vocal jazz ensemble, to Yakama lands named Kititas, currently occupied by Central Washington University, where I earned a bachelor's degree in music education with an emphasis in jazz education and double bass performance, which you see behind me. To Numu Washu Nue Nuwu lands named Udino, currently occupied by the University of Nevada, Reno, where I earned a Master of Arts degree in music history and there founded and directed the department's vocal jazz ensemble program. To Gabriel on Tongva lands named Tovangar, currently occupied by the University of California, Los Angeles, which, following Dr. Maria, was the second Alaska Native to earn a PhD in music studies there with a dissertation titled The Politics of Inuit Musical Modernities in Alaska. I work on Patwin lands named Putatoy, currently occupied by the University of California, Davis, where I am now an associate professor and graduate advisor in the Department of Native American Studies. And part of this third part of projects and thinking about ways of doing, which is in the book's title, is very much indebted to Linda Tuivai Smith's decolonizing methodologies and her initially what were 25 Indigenous projects. Now 20 further projects have been added in the third edition of that book. But it's one of these things where it's important to say the kinds of commitments that we have in our work that connect us to peoples and places, for example. And so one of the things that really occupies me and that I think is a grounding tenet of the book is how can music and sound studies, in our case, how can this research do work with, by, and for, in the case of the students I work with and the communities I'm involved with here, trans, queer, two-spirit, and Indigenous, Black, and peoples of color communities, communities that are historically excluded from music and sound studies. And we do that by valuing our ontologies and epistemologies as sounding methodologies for everything from history and genealogy, law, medicine, science, religion, environmental policy and management, pedagogy, and more, that a lot of folks I found over the years through my training in music and just kind of how music studies continues to be, it remains an object for study, right, as opposed to something that is actually bringing things into being. It's a world-making project, sounding and music is. And so my first book proposes native musicking as a project for amplifying the densities of Indigenous being as Indigenous peoples. It is for sounding our knowledges rooted in lands, waters, and sacred places, and that native musicking is also integral to self-determination movements and resurgence projects. And Maria noted the cover art, which was a joy to commission from Inanga artist Dustin Newman, who I think might still be a student at UAA or a recent alum, but it was just really important to think about how to tell a really complicated and dense story that is like musicking, native musicking in Alaska. Some of the other things that I'm doing right now too include co-editing a book with some colleagues called Sovereign Aesthetics, Indigenous Approaches to Sound Studies. And it's primarily, well, it is completely Indigenous-led and Native North American identified authors in this book. And with my work at UC Davis, I founded what I'm calling the Indigeneity Collaboratory. It's our social sciences and humanities lab that is really committed to uplifting Indigenous-led and indigeneity-centered research. And I have the privilege of working with these brilliant young people, several of whom are Alaska Native. I'm co-directing an NSF-funded radical fermentation project in partnership with researchers from Ilse Masatofik Lalit Nunat, or University of Greenland, which has been an unexpected joy, and just I learn an immense amount from the scientists I'm working with. And then also working recently with folks from the University of Malaya and the larger Association of Pacific Rim Universities Indigenous Knowledges Working Group to kind of think about broadly Asia-Pacific indigeneities through doing kind of using Zoom and our post-COVID reality of networking remotely to kind of talk about issues that that resonate across the Pacific. So those are some of the things that, let's see how to get out of here now. Some of the things that I'm into now, but that's a longer form kind of introduction that I've found works well in these Zoom spaces, and I definitely ask all of my students to construct them too. But again, it all began with Sandra and the kind of work I see she's doing with you at UAA.
Well, Shannon, thank you for your beautiful introduction and also for acknowledging Sandra Shaganoff-Stewart, who currently is the chair of Alaska Native Studies here at UAA. And as you pointed out, she's, we're in Alaska, as you know, Dr. Jessica, we're kind of in this language renaissance, right? We saw a renaissance in Alaska Native music and dance, and now we're seeing it happening with language and also body art. So it's really exciting that we're seeing curriculum and materials out there as well. So,
Mhm.
so appreciate that. And it's so nice to hear your language.
Mhm.
Yeah. So first of all, I so enjoyed your book. What I was, well, I'm impressed with it on so many levels because you provide some wonderful theoretical grounding about, really the indigenous perspective, right? And kind of providing a pathway forward on how to basically decolonize how Alaska Native music is viewed. And I so appreciate that you focused in on a lot of the contemporary, like Bumua, Byron Nikolai, and I want you to talk about them as well, because their music is definitely very contemporary. So it seems like this book kind of shatters that notion of like, indigenous people live in an unchanging world, and we're little like museum specimens. That's the
Mhm.
extreme view, but there's still a lot of that middle view that hangs in there. And so I really love how you provide even almost a vocabulary to look at this. So I'm curious as to how this book evolved. It's a very this book, I'm sure, was not easy to write. No books are, but this one has so much wonderful information, theoretical information, but biographies on some of the artists you've covered, the history of recording. So I'm just curious as to how the book came to be. What is the origin story of this wonderful book, Sound Relations?
Yeah, I get at it a little bit in the preface, right? But it really, as I mentioned in my introduction, I left Alaska after graduating high school I thought I was going to be a jazz musician. That's what I wanted to do, and I was doing jazz history. And then when I got to UCLA, I had passed all of my PhD qualifying exams and was like on my way to jazz historianville. But it was around that time in my late 20s when I really kind of I just kept being called home. Like I just really needed to be home. And so after I was able to leave LA, after I was done with coursework, I had the privilege and honor of participating in what was then called the Arctic Institute for Indigenous Leadership, which was led by Yvonne Peter and Kathy Rexford and Shauna Larson. And that experience completely changed everything about what then knew what I needed to do. I had always been a fan of Bumua, and so Bumua for me was where it started, and it was at that time still in musicology, right? And so I learned very quickly that musicology did not equip me to do the kind of work that I knew needed to be done. And even at that time, I didn't have a lot as you say, vocabulary to talk about it. I mean, I was a little bit underprepared. I knew why it was important as a young Alaska Native person that I heard something about myself in their music. And that's what I was really trying to get at and working backwards a little bit and looking at Nunamta. And so really thinking about, again, putting those two groups next to each other as examples of, late 20th century musicking that really does complicate kind of the ancient modern binary that we're always faced with. And I remember at that time of graduating that I was still kind of fighting that fight with musicologists, like, no, we're still here. And it's like, okay, well, that's definitely a fight that we still need to have. But there are more interesting questions, to me anyway, about, not only about issues of representation. And so that's another thing that um, as you probably also know, having spent some time in academia down here, that I wasn't hired into a music department, for example, that I was hired into Native American Studies after a postdoc in music. And I think that while I might have been irritated at that at first, like, no, I'm a musicologist, I need to be in a music department. Being in Native Studies freed me. It absolutely freed me, and to take the time that I needed to after putting this musicological dissertation out to transform it into something that it's still a tenure book, so it's a little bit kind of a little all over the place, but it was really my attempt at reframing it completely from studying the notes and transcribing things to really thinking about the histories and the contexts that are at play. What is it that really matters about these sounds? And I think to many of us, it's those family histories, it's those histories of movement, it's those histories of encounter with new sounds and new peoples, new foods, right? That it's about something that we don't often hear about ourselves. You know, we're always, as you say, in a museum case. And so what was so important about taking nearly 10 years after graduating to put this book out was really thinking about the phrase native ways of doing music history comes from ethnomusicologist Bev Diamond, and she was one of the few folks that also, after graduating musicology, I spent more time with ethnomusicologists because that's what people read me as, and just really thinking about um, that our ways of doing things, of course, are maybe complementary to, but very different from Euro-American ways of doing musicology or ethnomusicology. And so the example of putting the chapter in there on traditional drum dance resurgence, I didn't want to do it in a way that was just kind of like what people expect of ethnographic reportage, but really to position Teresa John and Tuna McIntyre and Marie Mead as public intellectuals, because they are, right? That they are the original musicologists. And it's this weird thing that academia does of, you know, creating boundaries or obstacles to acknowledging and respecting people for the gifts and talents and, you know, careers and expertise that they have. And so yeah, those are some of the things that, you know, I had to fight publishers along the way to convince them that, no, this is a music studies project. And I was extremely lucky to work with Mark Slobin and the American Music Spheres series that this came out with in Oxford, because there were lots of people before who were like, no, this should be in native studies. And I get that. But part of what I really needed to do with this book was to speak back to the disciplines that you and I come from, and demand that there be a space for our ways of doing music history in this kind of, you know, music study space. So it really was originally just a way that I felt like I could do something that maybe put into a book form some of the stories that really fascinate me about these. And again, these are just my ways of telling these histories. We would all write a very different book, and I'd probably write a very different book today, but it was important just to put it down because, again, the idea of density that I talk about in the book a lot, you know, in Alaska, 1 in 5 people that you meet are native. They identify as native. You come down to the States and it's like 0.002. And it's even worse when you look at academic spaces and demographics. And, you know, we're so often the one and only. And so by having just a density of histories and peoples and sounds, that was what I was hoping to achieve with what the stories that I tell in this book.
Which by the way, you did a beautiful job of that, and I'm glad that you highlighted just now and talking about your book, but also in the book itself, this idea of different worldviews, right? The Western worldview, the musicological worldview, or the ethnomusicological worldview versus you know, what's happening here with not only performers, but also scholars like Dr. Teresa John. But I really appreciated in that chapter, chapter 3, I think, the Traditioning a Resurgence Anthem, a great chapter title too, by the way. But I really appreciate that you included Dr. Quagley's, Oscar Quagley's model of worldview, and you define it. And so you provide, for a non-Indigenous person that's reading this, you're basically providing them, hey, there's another way to look at this. And here's a really good model. And of course, there's other models too. But I really enjoyed how you did that. And then you included some lovely biographies. And I guess biography might not be the right term, because you talk about address Byron Nicolai, his amazing work, of course, Dr. Teresa John, Marie Mead, Tuna McIntyre. But I was very impressed by the depth that you put them in the context, right? They're contemporary people, the context from and why their work is so important. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, as you were writing that chapter, keeping it away from the, as ethnomusicologists, we're trained to really do this very kind of cut and dried kind of biography, but this one you put more of a worldview context in there as well. And I don't know if you want to address that, but
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, Coagli's work is what I think really, in addition to the Arctic Indigenous Leadership Institute that I was able to participate in, finding Yupiaq, where Yupiaq worldview was life-changing for me, and thinking about how he, as a science educator with an equally complicated and dense background, having been also like a CEO of a native corporation and all of those things, he lived an incredibly just an amazing life. And then to be, in my mind, one of the most important theorists and kind of intellectuals in Alaska Native scholarship, right? That to think about how, again, it's about the framing, right? And what I was trying to do in thinking about and thinking with and researching Teresa and Chuna and Marie's in that particular chapter, right? Like everything that they do and that they put out into the world is demonstrating and doing Yupiaq worldview, right? It's Yuyark. It's and now I think even Anne Fina Burden finally one of her millions of books, right? She put one out called Yuyark recently with a lot of her collaborators, and so this kind of attention to worldviews as world making, right? And I think another thing about how I was envisioning framing so much of the book in that particular chapter, right, is we love to focus on difference, right? And that's, again, one of the main things I'm trying to get at in the book, is that it's about a density. Because even though we would assume that these three public intellectuals would be very similar, they come from very different villages, and they bring very different kinds of expertise and skills to something like a Nunamta, whether they were going in and out of that group over the years, right? And continuing to lead that in the 2022. So this idea that these even so-called culture areas, as ethnomusicology might call them, are incredibly dense, right? And that even, within families, right, you have just an immense amount of different ways of doing things. So anyway, this idea that I would always be referencing a Western or European frame to talk about those three individuals, I was really trying to, especially in that chapter, doing everything I could to not do that. Like, it was a conscious decision to try and not use any framing language other than what certainly Coagli and Harold Napoleon and a lot of other Yupik intellectuals have published, right? And just thinking about what is a more efficient or effective and really, at the end of the day, ethical way of telling these stories. I am not Yupik, as I explained in the book and as I just explained in my introduction, but they're all with the immense amount of materials that Yupik speaking people have put out and scholars and intellectuals. It's just, there's no reason to not do that now. And that my hope, and is that we start having the same kind of density of materials in Dena'ina language and about Dena'ina peoples, and that it's just one of the things that really it wasn't that it was easy to pull together something that was Yupik centered, but that is where the archive is right now. And so it's hopefully a call to build up the archives across the many different other culture areas in our state, right? That there's so many so many communities that probably in their basements have records of garage bands and things that just we need to hear these things. I'd love to hear them.
And also, well, referencing, of course, Dr. Teresa John's work, not only her dissertation, but her book on Yupik music and dance that she co-authored with a photographer and Anne Fina Parea, James Barker, right? And in that same chapter, I really like how in one of your tables you really she put the form and analysis of the kind of the classic form and structure of a Yupik song, and using it, of course, in the Yupiaq or Yugstun language, which I thought was phenomenal, and that's why her work is so powerful. And you included it in here, right? So again, using an indigenous reference that has that worldview rather than, using, some other kind of very Western based
Like sonata
analysis.
form.
Yes. And I was, as musicologist or ethnomusicologist, and we know that our field is evolving, right? So clearly, our early on, our field was sister field of anthropology, which was an American anthropology, was built on the backs of studying Native Americans, and
Mhm.
of course, we were always left out of, or we were voiceless. We were just to be examined and the transcriptions of the recordings and through the lens of whoever was collecting the information. Now, there's few exceptions out there for the most part, but we're moving forward, and we're evolving. So clearly, I think the book that you have, I think will offer a new way for people to look at Indigenous music, right? To who's out there that really is providing an intellectual foreground to this, who
Mhm.
the Indigenous community is doing that. And I think you referenced Marie Mead, of course, and she is our longtime collaborator with Anne Fina Brereton, and
Mhm.
our long-term Yupik language instructor here at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and of course the mother of two of the members of Bumua, right? So she's kind of one of those linchpin people, right?
Mhm.
She's like, and I so appreciate that you really give her the title of really intellect, and because I think a lot of the Western perspective is we have a tendency, not we, but they have a tendency to kind of diminish our roles as a very singular. So I do appreciate that as well.
Mhm.
Um, and that was one of my favorite chapters. The other chapter that I really loved was number 4,
Mhm.
which was incorporating inheritance and complementarity. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what you mean by incorporating inheritance, but complementarity.
Yeah, and so that chapter was really again thinking about the way that Tuna McIntyre talks about just some of the ways, because you'll hear in Indian country a lot of times like it's in our blood or it's in our DNA, but I think that what we know about relationality in many Native communities is that it's not only blood and it's not only DNA, right? That Native communities will make relations for any number of reasons. And I know that like recently, adopting politicians is like a strategy that some of our communities do, and for good reason. And so this idea that, Bumua again was where so much of this book started as, in dissertation form, and then just kind of thinking about them, all the time for, 2 decades as a student and now educator, that so much of what folks might hear, and one of the ways that I talk about this in the book is how in the United States, right, there's this kind of overwhelming black white binary in at least music studies, and I think popular culture too. I mean, you see that whenever there's a census that comes out, and like, there's black and Asian and Latinx and then everything else or something else, that were never included, or left out on purpose or by accident. But this idea that so-called black coded musics like funk and R&B and hip hop and those kinds of things, that there's lots of debates about cultural appropriation, for example, that have been lobbied at Indigenous artists, when the more kind of nuanced conversation about that is really about how Chuna and others talk about not only inheritance in terms of when you're encountering people and you're in relation with people, that it's not property, right? That these sounds aren't property all the time. So of course, there's going to be cultures that do have understandings and words and language for ownership and property, but that it's more about, in the case of musicking, that sounding of a relationship, that sounding of time having been spent with people and in community, and in the case of Bumua, having two of the members being self-identified Afro-Yupik peoples, that Marie Mead is Philip and Stephen's mother, but their father being a African-American man who came to Alaska in the 70s, right? Or maybe even the 60s. But this idea of not only this blood and DNA narrative, but the communities that they've moved throughout their upbringing. So that part of, making sure to talk about the ways that they moved, not only through Alaska, but back and forth with Philadelphia and Seattle and the kinds of places that their families were located, and the sounds and the kind of things that they carry with them from those interactions and encounters, and bringing back into village settings or back into urban anchorage settings. And the complementarity of that is that we want to think sometimes in our binary thinking in at least the lower 48 that Indigenous and Black are separate, right? That there's no mingling, right? But that's where the density argument comes in, and that this idea that obviously it is possible to be Afro-Yupik, it is possible to be both and, not either or. And the complementarity of not only that, so much of Indigenous rights are bound up in African American rights and human rights just more broadly. Our liberation and as well as our struggles are intertwined. And so in terms of thinking about what it means to argue for resurgence and revitalization and sovereignty, and a lot of the things we say and we hear a lot in Native studies, we need to also be in constant conversation with our Black and African American relations. That so much of what we are all struggling against is intertwined, and to separate them out is part of what many people say is maybe one thing that hasn't gone as productively or generatively as it could in the last couple, the last decade for sure, right? So much has happened just in the last 10 years in terms of racial reckonings in our country, but we can't, on the one hand, ignore or continue Indigenous erasure, but we also need to make sure that we're not engaging in anti-Black behavior. And so that's kind of where, over the course of a decade or more of after graduating, thinking about what is really just awesome and fantastic about what Bumua does in not only their community work and their media work, is that they are performing and that they are sounding this solidarity, and not only just in who they're in, how they are, their being and their weighing, their knowing and their doing, but just that how they interact with folks, both locally, nationally, and internationally, is being kind of ambassadors for that kind of dual inheritance and complementarity that they carry, but also that everyone has the potential to carry if they kind of ditch the either or thinking, and kind of in a more simplistic way, thinking both and, that all of us need to be uplifting, all pulling everybody with us as we're doing this work, right?
And then of course they're I mean, as performers, and I'm hoping that whoever is watching this recorded Zoom has the opportunity to see them perform, because they're amazing performers. I mean, amazing. And they've been, as you mentioned, they've been creating CDs and videos and performing for over 20 years. Like what was their, when were they born? What year was Bumua officially born?
95, 96.
Okay. All right. And they're still, and of course, Karina Moeller, who's a Greenlandic Inuit, is their female amazing singer. But they add so many creative elements to their compositions and their pieces. But you also mentioned their connection to the global Indigenous community, not just in Alaska, but other places as well, which is awesome. So one of the other things, so in your position at UC Davis, so I'm moving now to just addressing your role as, and you mentioned, of course, that Alaska Native or Indigenous scholars, we don't grow on trees, and when you have students, and it seems to me that you've been doing a very impressive job of identifying, mentoring, and recruiting graduate Indigenous students into the program at UC Davis, or And I don't know if you want to talk about if how important that role is for you, but I know that you're doing amazing work in that area that it should I laud you for.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and I think it was around the time that I graduated that you and I first met and had done a couple of those panels at the conferences, right, at the Native American Indigenous Studies Association and also the probably Society for Ethnomusicology, right? And so thinking back to one of the things that I needed to know back when I was finishing my dissertation was like, how many of us are there in terms of Alaska Natives who have survived, a PhD program? And thinking about, because we always hear like, oh, I must be the only one, or maybe there's only five. But being a math nerd, I needed to try to figure out how many. And luckily, folks at UAF had been doing that. Ray Barnhart had made a list when they were developing the PhD program up there, and by the time I think it was 2011, 2012, again, when you and I and Teresa were presenting together, we thought maybe there were in the 50s, right? And just like a couple of years ago, other folks have kept the list up, and we're well over 100 now, which is exciting, right? And to think about what it means to continue to support and show that there is this deep lineage of those of us who have survived this and that are continuing to pursue this. And it's an idea of representation and density that, to me, my role, I have 10 advisees, which is a lot, PhD advisees, but I couldn't imagine having less, to be honest, because I think it's so important that the next generation not only have somebody like me who's going to be, supporting them in the most positive kind of bordering on cheerleadery kind of space. Because so many times, I'm sure you heard no a lot coming through these programs, and just people putting up roadblocks and obstacles. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we're doing in Native Studies, is that we are lucky to attract brilliant students who are doing work with, by, and for oftentimes their home communities or communities that they've grown up in. And, just being someone who can help them navigate this really violent place that wasn't made for us, these structures in academia, I feel like is some of the most important work that I do. The book, of course, again, was a 10-year project. It had to be done so I could keep this job and kind of keep, the door open and getting as many more of us through. But yeah, I learn an immense amount, and that's one of the deep joys of doing this work. And I mentioned a little bit in the book that while, I was fortunate to grow up in our ancestral homelands, but I've been outside as long as I was inside, and I've learned an incredible amount from not only my colleagues who do work in Mexico and Peru and Guatemala, and so an immense amount about the global South that I never would have known, to the particularities of California Indian histories and the kind of solidarities that we have, and that Dena'ina people were here at one point. That Fort Ross is this amazing location for Alaska Natives and diaspora, forced or otherwise. And having an Inanga student doing that work, Lauren Peters, who's doing a lot of that work, and she's repatriating stolen children from Carlisle, right? And so these students are just doing amazing work, and if all I can do is just, again, keep the door open for them to come through, help them find resources to fund the revolution, then that's going to be a pretty good career, I think.
And of course, you were referencing the tribalography that you put together that basically tracked how many Alaska Native PhDs are there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, that was soon picked up by Dr. Alberta Jones, who did her dissertation on it.
Mm-hmm.
And she's actually now kind of keeping a soft ledger of that list. So, and of course, it illustrates what we kind of had a sense of, that there's not that many of us. But now we know, right? And then in terms of our role as teachers, right? Or I teach strictly undergraduate students here at UAA. And when I was at the University of New Mexico, it was an undergraduate program. So my lens is very different for the students I teach than at the graduate level. But I think both levels are important, and we need more Indigenous scholars, and we need more Indigenous scholarship. And I think your book is definitely a providing that as well. And you mentioned, of course, academia. It's a very Western based institution, slow to change, but it does
Mhm.
change and it does evolve as well. And all of our ethnic, quote unquote, ethnic studies programs were really born out of radical protest movements from the 1960s. It wasn't out of kindness that universities
Yeah.
said, we need to
No, it was a
borrow.
demand.
Yeah, it was a radical demand of that, and it's all evolved very differently. I've been involved in a project that's been funded by the Spencer Foundation, and documenting the founding of our different programs here in Alaska: UAF,
Mhm.
UAS, Illisavic, and APU,
Mhm.
and of course, basically all of those programs were really founded out of struggle. So I like this phrase of sites of struggle, sites of success, because there
Mhm.
is success and there is changing as we move forward. And of course, some of that deals with curriculum. And I don't know if you want to address it, at your current institution, when you were there, did you have to like develop some new curriculums or adapt or adopt existing curriculums?
I think one of the good things about having been fortunate to have spent this is my 10th year at UC Davis, is that, it's a program that's been around. The PhD program has been around for 20 plus years now. And then the undergraduate was started again, in the late 60s, so 50 years. And I think that, again, I've been able to frame courses and to develop new courses in ways that would never have flown in a music studies department. And it really has everything to do with benefiting from that history of activism here in the Bay Area in particular, but at UC Davis specifically. And so I think that I'm incredibly fortunate that way to be in a place that has this history. I'm probably the first Alaska Native they've had in the department. But I definitely think I was told when I was hired that yeah, we're looking to actually look northward, right, to the above the 49th parallel. And I'm like, I can do that. And so I think that our student body has also expanded to include, like I say, more Alaska Native students are coming. Thankfully, more California Indian students are also enrolling, and yeah, it's I, there is, though, the danger, I think, that some administrations will be like, oh, well, you have a department, so that's solved, right? So I think that even within this mammoth system that is the University of California with our 10 campuses, right? Until this year, we were the only department. UCLA now has one, a Department of American Indian Studies. But, just because we have even the kind of structure of a department doesn't mean that the fight is over, right? And so everything from how these courses are labeled for diversity credits for students in the sciences, for example, that's an ongoing issue, right? Of there's still resistance to learning more than Euro-American histories and more than Euro-American ways of doing things. And so yeah, it's, on the one hand, I feel very fortunate to benefit from being in a place that was already established. But I'm definitely very aware of kind of when you go outside of Native Studies department, that there's still a lot of resistance to what it is we represent and what it is we're bringing into being with our training the next PhDs, our undergraduate majors as well. So yeah, it's the fight, the struggle continues 50 plus years later, right?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, progress is made, but at our various institutions, and of course, it all depends, of course, on leadership, right? I mean, it really comes down to chancellor or provost.
Mhm.
Universities are, I always compare it to the military. It's very hierarchical. And I've been in academia now. I don't know. I've been here now 11 years, and I was at UNM for I think 12 years, and at IAIA for 2. So
Mhm.
I sometimes say I feel like an old military general, because it is a structure, and I know the structure.
Mhm.
It does change, but it can be very frustrating as well.
Mhm.
But I'm so pleased, though, that you've been really able to, because I do feel like curriculum is just foundational. Curriculum is the heart and soul of education.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to indigenize the curriculum or create new methodologies, new epistemologies, new ontologies, I think is so critical to the work of Indigenous studies. And you've been doing that now. Now, of course, your husband also is a scholar and doing very similar work as well. And so what a great partnership, though, that you're both academics, you're both musicians, and that must also be such a great, I mean, you have somebody that completely understands your work and your intellectual work and your hard work of being a faculty member. And then, identifying, the current trajectory of, who we are as Indigenous people. And you reference you're focusing in on language, which is fantastic. It's so beautiful, and more materials out there. And then that almost intuitive, we can't even describe it, or I would have a hard time putting words to that intuitive, why do we feel so good, if we're a member of an Indigenous group, or, I am with Anchich Kwan, and how come I'm so happy after why am I absolutely exuberant and happy after our dance practice? I don't know why. I just am, and I love it. And so this idea of intuition, I think, which is also maybe, I'm looking, of course, the young people, because they're always they're the ones that created the Renaissance of music and dance here in Alaska. It was really young people. Same thing with language, and now with body art. And I don't know if you have any comments on that, or you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, that how certain things resonated with you and just opened doors.
No, I think there's an immense amount of things to be excited and hopeful for when we look at this, either the students that come through our classes or just what's happening, for example, in the Anchorage Native art scene, right? That there's just so much support that there maybe wasn't even just a decade ago within the Native art scene. I mean, just having to kind of watch it from afar, there was nothing really growing up, even just outside of Anchorage. So to see that not only Alaska Native artists moving within the art scenes in Anchorage and the villages as well, but also, being funded by so many of these foundations in the lower 48 and some even globally, that it's just, there seems to be a growing understanding that obviously all of these knowledges are interrelated to, finding solutions to the kind of more, sexy topics that, climate change is obviously a very serious issue, right? But there's so much other things that are in relation to that, in terms of like food security. That's just one of the things that we talk about all the time in relation to the work we're doing with Greenlanders, that, everybody wants to talk about the melting glaciers and the ice caps, which of course we need to. But that also kind of drowns out a lot of the conversations about, legislating subsistence lifestyles and, colonial structures that remain intact but not really talked about yet. Greenland is definitely in a situation where it's still not okay to talk about decolonizing anything, because you might hurt the Danes' feelings. And so it's just this really interesting, moment that, even with just kind of broader Indigenous visibility with like res dogs, right, reservation dogs and media and films and music, that we're in this really, it's like 2000s, right, when Adanarshuat and Zachariah Kunuk, and that kind of moment of Indigenous cinema and filmmaking. I feel like we're kind of in a new renaissance, a resurgence of more, as you mentioned, like the tattooing art and lots of other kinds of creative and performing arts and expression, right? That it's a really neat moment that, hopefully those coming up after us will write books about that, right? That this will be the next creative and performing arts related book.
I'm so pleased that you highlight the role of the artist, right? I mean, primarily your book is looking at the musical artist, but the visual art and the visual artist, there's a really famous quote by Trotsky, and it's been paraphrasing, but it translated into English. It's like, artists do not create work that reflects society. They take a hammer and they break it. And so the role of the artist, I think, Indigenous artists in particular, has been really critical to kind of also moving away from these older ways that Indigenous people are looked upon, and also the importance of Indigenous scholars like yourself that are actively writing and producing books and articles, and also work, your mentoring work, your creative work, that are moving us forward as well. So we're coming to a close, but I guess my last question to you is, you mentioned the beginning of your introduction some of the things that you're working on, but are you looking at a new book or a new article, or maybe you probably have like 25 things you're working on at the same time?
One of the things that I'm really going to say out loud here, just so I can kind of hold myself accountable, is getting back to musicking myself more. Is that having two small children and trying to get to the 10-year goal really took me away from actually musicking myself. And so the book is also part of living vicariously through musicians that I admire and love, and just I want other people to be drawn to listen to them. That's why the discography is in the front. Go find these people. But yeah, I want to get back to kind of the creative part, because I improvise all the time in the classroom, but it's been a while since he and I have spent much time together. So
Yeah, I see that. I see some other guitars.
Yeah, these are John
Bass
Carlos's,
guitar.
and then this is
Okay. Okay. Anyway, well, I want to thank you so much, Chinan, Gunal Cheesh. That's thank you in Tlingit, and also thank you in Denina for the time that you've taken. And again, congratulations on this amazing book. I've very much enjoyed it. And of course, I've had the fortune to meet some of your students that are, working, Haley Hanestepatin is here right now at UAA. Colton Brandow was here in Anchorage about 2 weeks ago. And I happened to be in the office, and I didn't know who he was. And he was saying, is Alaska Native Studies around here somewhere? And I'm like, yeah, it's around here, but no one's there. Anyway, so he introduced himself, and it was just really lovely. So it's just so fun. Anyway, again, thank you so much, and have a great week. I know you're starting your term this week, and just delightful. And I'm hoping to see you at some point, maybe at an upcoming conference, or maybe the next time you come home. But anyway, have a great day. Tell your husband I also said hello.
I will. Thank you.
Okay.